In the winter of 1851 in Greene County, Alabama, something happened that made slave owners across the South check their locks at night and watch their food more carefully. A woman named Nancy Kelly. 5 masters blinded over the course of 8 years, and a pattern so subtle that nobody connected the incidents until it was far too late. If stories about hidden resistance matter to you, about the quiet wars enslaved people fought when open rebellion meant death, then stay with me. Because what Nancy Kelly did between 1843 and 1851 tells you everything you need to know about patience, about calculated revenge, and about how the powerless can destroy the powerful one, careful step at a time. The year 1843 sits in the middle of slavery's most profitable period. Cotton was booming. The domestic slave trade was at its peak. Enslaved people were being bought and sold across state lines like livestock. Families separated. Individuals moved from plantation to plantation, based purely on economic calculation. For enslaved people, this mobility was terrifying. Every sale meant losing whatever small community you'd built, whatever fragile relationships you'd formed. It meant starting over with a new master, whose temperament and cruelty were unknown quantities. Nancy Kelly experienced this instability more than most. Born around 1820 on a plantation in Virginia, she was sold south as a young woman, part of the massive forced migration that moved enslaved people from the Upper South to the expanding cotton frontier. By 1843, when our story really begins, Nancy was about 23 years old. She'd already been owned by 2 different masters in Alabama. She was what traders called seasoned, experienced in plantation work, unlikely to run, apparently resigned to her condition. But Nancy Kelly was not resigned. She was planning. Nancy had certain advantages that made her valuable to slave owners and dangerous to them, though they didn't recognize the danger. She could read. Someone had taught her secretly in Virginia. She was observant, noticing patterns and details that others missed. And she had access to knowledge about herbs and plants, having worked alongside older enslaved women who knew traditional medicine. In the enslaved community, she was known as someone you could trust with secrets, someone who listened more than she spoke, someone who remembered everything. In the white community, she was considered a good worker, quiet, obedient, skilled at household tasks. The kind of enslaved person that masters bragged about owning, no trouble, reliable, worth her value. What nobody recognized was that Nancy Kelly had decided something fundamental about her life. She would never be safe, never be free, never be able to protect herself from the violence of slavery. But she could make the men who owned her pay a price for owning her. A price they wouldn't connect to her until it was too late. She would take their eyes. Not literally. That would be too obvious, too quickly connected to her. But she would blind them slowly, carefully, using methods that looked like accidents or illness. And she would do it to every master who treated her with particular cruelty. It was a plan born of absolute powerlessness and infinite patience. And it started with Robert Morrison. Robert Morrison purchased Nancy Kelly in March 1843. He owned a medium-sized plantation outside Eutaw, Alabama. About 800 acres, 40 enslaved people, profitable but not wealthy. Morrison was 42 years old, widowed, with a reputation for being a harsh master. He bought Nancy specifically to work in his house. His previous house slaves had either been sold or had died under suspicious circumstances that the white community chose not to investigate too closely. Morrison needed someone capable, and Nancy came recommended by the trader who sold her. For the first few weeks, Nancy learned Morrison's household routines. She cleaned, cooked, served meals, did laundry. She watched how Morrison treated his other enslaved people. The casual violence, the unpredictable anger, the way he used fear to maintain control. Morrison had particular habits that Nancy noted carefully. He drank heavily in the evenings. He kept a lamp burning in his study late into the night while he did paperwork. He trusted Nancy to bring him food and drink without supervision because she seemed so obedient. The incident that sealed Morrison's fate happened about a month after Nancy arrived. An enslaved man named Joseph had broken a tool in the field. Morrison had him tied to a post in the yard and whipped while everyone watched, 30 lashes that left Joseph's back in ribbons. Nancy was forced to watch. All the house slaves were. Morrison wanted them to see what happened when you cost him money by breaking his property. That night, Nancy stood in her cabin and made her decision. Morrison would pay. Not immediately, that would be too obvious, but soon. And he would pay with his sight. Nancy began her research. She had access to Morrison's small library and would read medical books when he was drunk or away. She talked to older enslaved women about traditional remedies and poisons. She learned which plants caused which symptoms, which substances could be added to food in small amounts without being detected. What she learned about eyes was fascinating and terrifying. The human eye is remarkably vulnerable. It depends on delicate structures that can be damaged by inflammation, by certain chemicals, by progressive degradation that looks like natural aging or disease. Nancy focused on a particular plant that grew wild around the plantation, white snake root. In large doses, it was obviously poisonous, but in very small amounts, consumed regularly over time, it caused a condition that looked like progressive vision problems. The eyes would become inflamed, vision would blur. Eventually, if the exposure continued, it could lead to blindness. The genius of Nancy's plan was its slowness. She didn't want Morrison to go blind overnight. That would trigger investigation. She wanted his vision to deteriorate gradually, in a way that looked like illness or natural degradation. She started adding tiny amounts of white snake root extract to Morrison's evening whiskey. Not enough to make him immediately sick, just enough to begin the slow process of damaging his eyes. Morrison noticed nothing at first. Why would he? His whiskey tasted the same. Nancy remained the perfect servant, quiet, efficient, invisible. After about 2 months, Morrison started complaining about headaches. Then about his eyes feeling tired. He blamed it on the paperwork he did late at night, on getting older, on the Alabama sun. Nancy continued the careful poisoning. Small amounts, irregularly spaced, so there was no obvious pattern. Sometimes she'd go a week without adding anything, then resume. The irregularity made it seem even more like a natural illness. By 6 months, Morrison's vision was noticeably degraded. He had trouble reading. He stumbled on steps he should have been able to see clearly. He consulted a doctor, who examined him and found inflammation, but no obvious cause. The doctor prescribed rest and drops that did nothing, because the problem wasn't infection. It was poison. Nancy watched Morrison struggle with increasing satisfaction. She never showed emotion, never gave any sign that she knew exactly what was happening to him. She was just the quiet house slave, concerned and helpful, when Morrison fumbled with things he could no longer see clearly. After 10 months, Morrison was functionally blind. He could see shapes and light, but couldn't read, couldn't recognize faces clearly, couldn't manage his plantation accounts. He became dependent on Nancy and the other house slaves to guide him, to read to him, to handle tasks he could no longer do himself. The other enslaved people noticed Morrison's condition, but didn't connect it to Nancy. They thought it was divine justice, God punishing a cruel master. Some of them celebrated quietly. Morrison couldn't watch them as carefully now, couldn't see infractions, was less effective at maintaining his reign of terror. Morrison's relatives came to visit, concerned about his condition. They discussed selling the plantation, moving him to town where he could be cared for. In the meantime, Morrison needed to reduce his holdings, sell some of his enslaved people to raise cash. In January 1844, Nancy Kelly was sold to a new master, William Barrett. William Barrett lived 40 miles away in Greensboro. He was younger than Morrison, 35 years old, married, with 2 young children. He bought Nancy on the recommendation of Morrison's overseer, who said she was an excellent houseworker, capable and trustworthy. Barrett had no idea that his purchase had just made a terrible mistake. Nancy arrived at Barrett's home and went through the same process she'd gone through at Morrison's, learning routines, identifying vulnerabilities, watching and waiting. Barrett was different from Morrison in some ways. He was more calculated in his cruelty, less impulsively violent. He didn't whip people in fits of rage. He did it systematically, keeping careful records of infractions and punishments. But he was still cruel, and Nancy had already decided that every master who owned her would pay the same price. The incident that sealed Barrett's fate came 3 weeks after Nancy arrived. Barrett's wife, Margaret, accused an enslaved girl named Lucy of stealing a ribbon. Lucy insisted she hadn't, but Margaret didn't believe her. Barrett had Lucy whipped, 15 lashes for theft. Nancy was sent to tend Lucy's wounds afterward and found the ribbon in Margaret's own sewing basket, where she'd left it and forgotten. Nancy showed the ribbon to Margaret, hoping the girl would be exonerated. Instead, Margaret told Nancy to burn the ribbon and never speak of it. Lucy's punishment would stand because to admit error would be to show weakness. That night, Nancy began planning Barrett's blinding. Barrett was more careful than Morrison had been. He didn't drink as heavily, wasn't as careless about what he consumed. Nancy would need to be more creative. She shifted her approach. Instead of targeting his food or drink directly, she targeted something else: his eye drops. Barrett suffered from seasonal allergies that made his eyes water and itch. He used drops prescribed by a doctor, a simple saline solution meant to soothe irritation. The drops were kept in a small bottle in his bedroom, and Nancy was responsible for cleaning the room. Nancy began adulterating the drops. She used a different substance this time, a preparation made from Jimson weed, carefully processed to extract the compounds that would cause progressive damage to the eyes. In the concentrations Nancy used, it wouldn't cause immediate blindness, but it would create cumulative damage over time. Every few days, when Barrett was out of the house, Nancy would add a few drops of her preparation to his medicine bottle. Not enough to change the appearance or smell, just enough to ensure that every time Barrett used his eye drops to soothe irritation, he was actually poisoning his own eyes. The method was brilliant in its subtlety. Barrett was using medicine prescribed by a doctor, kept in his own bedroom, applied by his own hand. When his vision started to deteriorate, there would be no obvious cause to investigate. It took longer than it had with Morrison. Barrett was younger, healthier, and the dosing was less consistent. But after about 8 months, Barrett started complaining about his vision. His eyes were constantly irritated. He had trouble reading. He saw halos around lights at night. The doctor was baffled. The eye drops should have been helping, not making things worse. But Barrett's condition continued to deteriorate. The doctor prescribed rest, different medications, even suggested Barrett might need spectacles. Nothing helped, because the problem wasn't natural degeneration or illness. It was careful, calculated poisoning that Nancy continued with patient precision. By early 1845, Barrett's vision was severely compromised. He could still see, but not well enough to read or do detailed work. His wife had to take over managing the household accounts. His overseer handled more of the plantation management. Barrett became increasingly frustrated and irritable. His deteriorating vision made him feel vulnerable, less in control. He took out his frustration on his enslaved people, ordering more frequent punishments for smaller infractions. Nancy watched this with grim satisfaction. She never showed emotion, never gave any hint that she understood exactly why Barrett's eyes were failing. She was just the quiet, capable house slave who'd been unlucky enough to work for two masters who'd both developed vision problems. Nobody connected the two incidents. Why would they? Morrison and Barrett lived 40 miles apart, had different lifestyles, different habits. The only thing they had in common was owning Nancy Kelly, and nobody thought an enslaved woman could be responsible for something so subtle and sophisticated. In June 1845, Barrett decided he needed to simplify his life. Managing the plantation was becoming too difficult with his failing vision. He would sell some of his assets, including several enslaved people he considered less essential. Nancy Kelly was sold again, this time to a man named Thomas Crawford. Thomas Crawford was the worst of Nancy's masters so far. He was 50 years old, brutal in ways that Morrison and Barrett hadn't been. He owned a large plantation near Akron, Alabama, and was known for treating his enslaved people with exceptional cruelty. Crawford believed that fear was the only effective management tool. He whipped people publicly for entertainment. He separated families casually. He sold children away from their mothers as punishment. He was, in the language of the time, a hard master. Nancy arrived at Crawford's plantation in July 1845 and immediately understood she'd been sold into a worse situation. The other enslaved people looked broken in ways she hadn't seen before. They moved carefully, spoke quietly, avoided drawing attention. Crawford assigned Nancy to work in the house, but made it clear she was there on trial. One mistake, and she'd be sent to the fields, which on Crawford's plantation meant a death sentence. The field workers rarely lasted more than a few years before they were worked to death. Nancy kept her head down and watched. Crawford had routines she could exploit. He was meticulous about certain things: his clothing, his meals, his grooming. He was vain about his appearance and spent significant time each morning preparing himself for the day. The incident that sealed Crawford's fate happened 2 weeks after Nancy arrived. Crawford had an enslaved man named Peter tied up and whipped for looking at him disrespectfully. 30 lashes while everyone watched. Peter's crime had been making eye contact when Crawford was speaking to him. Nancy watched Peter's back being torn apart for the crime of seeing his master, and she decided Crawford would learn what it meant to not see anything at all. Crawford's vanity gave Nancy her opportunity. He used a special hair tonic every morning, an expensive preparation he ordered from New Orleans, made with various oils and extracts, meant to keep his hair thick and dark despite his age. Nancy was responsible for maintaining Crawford's grooming supplies. She had access to all his bottles and potions, and she had developed, by this point, considerable skill in adulterating substances without detection. The hair tonic became her weapon. She began adding a preparation to it, a mixture she'd developed using compounds from several different plants, including pokeweed and mountain laurel. The preparation was absorbed through the scalp, and over time would cause neurological effects that included progressive vision damage. The method was slower than what she'd used on Morrison or Barrett, but it was also more subtle. Crawford was poisoning himself every morning when he carefully applied his expensive hair tonic, and he had no idea. For months, nothing seemed to happen. Nancy continued her work, careful and invisible. Crawford continued his cruelty, seemingly untouched by consequence. Then, about 5 months in, Crawford started having headaches, then sensitivity to light, then trouble with his vision, particularly peripheral vision. Crawford consulted multiple doctors. They examined him, found no obvious cause, prescribed various treatments. Nothing helped, because none of them thought to test the hair tonic Crawford applied religiously every morning. Nancy maintained her poisoning campaign with perfect consistency. Every week, she'd add more of her preparation to Crawford's bottle. He'd use it, compliment how well it worked to keep his hair healthy, and slowly poison himself. By mid-1846, Crawford's vision was noticeably failing. He started having trouble seeing things at the edges of his visual field. He'd turn his head to look at something and be surprised by objects he hadn't noticed. He bumped into things. He had trouble reading. His wife noticed. His children noticed. His overseer noticed. They all encouraged him to see doctors, to rest, to take better care of himself. Crawford refused to admit weakness. He pushed through, denying that anything was seriously wrong. But his vision continued to deteriorate. The other enslaved people began to notice that Crawford wasn't watching them as carefully. He couldn't see infractions he would have punished before. He missed things. His control over the plantation was slipping as his eyes failed him. Nancy watched all of this with satisfaction that she never allowed to show on her face. 3 masters now. 3 men who'd owned her, who'd used their power over her, who'd perpetuated the violence of slavery. And all 3 were blind or going blind, stumbling through their lives without understanding why. By late 1846, Crawford's condition had deteriorated enough that managing the plantation was becoming impossible. His relatives started discussing options, selling the property, moving Crawford somewhere he could be cared for properly. In December 1846, Nancy Kelly was sold to her 4th master, Henry Wilson. Henry Wilson was different from the others. He was younger, only 32, and newly wealthy from a successful cotton harvest. He'd purchased a plantation near Forkland, Alabama, and was building his holdings quickly. Wilson wasn't particularly cruel by the standards of the time. He didn't whip people excessively. He didn't separate families unless economically necessary. He was pragmatic rather than sadistic. Nancy arrived at Wilson's plantation in January 1847 and went through her now familiar routine. Watch, learn, wait. For a few weeks, she considered not poisoning Wilson. He was better than the others. Not kind, no master was truly kind, but not gratuitously cruel either. Then Wilson purchased a woman named Clara and her 2 children from an estate sale. Clara had been sold because her previous master had died in debt, and his creditors were liquidating his holdings. Clara's children were 8 and 10 years old. 2 weeks after arriving at Wilson's plantation, Wilson sold them, separately, to different buyers. Clara screamed when they took her children, begged Wilson not to separate them. Wilson was unmoved. He'd gotten good prices for both children. That was what mattered. Clara's feelings were irrelevant. Nancy watched Clara collapse in grief, watched Wilson walk away without a second glance, and made her decision. Wilson would pay the same price as the others. Wilson's vulnerability was his coffee. He drank it constantly, at breakfast, mid-morning, after lunch, in the evening. He was particular about how it was prepared, wanted it strong and sweet. Nancy was responsible for preparing Wilson's coffee. She had access to the coffee beans, the sugar, the water, and she had, by now, refined her techniques to a precise science. She began adding ground seeds from Carolina jessamine to Wilson's coffee. The plant contained compounds that, in small repeated doses, caused muscle weakness and vision problems. The symptoms would develop gradually, looking like illness rather than poisoning. The dosing was tricky. Too much would cause obvious poisoning symptoms. Too little would have no effect. Nancy had to find the exact amount that would cause cumulative damage without triggering immediate suspicion. She started with tiny amounts, barely detectable. Wilson noticed nothing. She increased slightly, watching for symptoms. Still nothing. After about 2 months, Wilson mentioned feeling tired. A month after that, he complained about occasional double vision. His hands were less steady than usual. The doctor diagnosed overwork and prescribed rest. Wilson ignored the advice. He had a plantation to run, cotton to sell, wealth to build. Nancy continued her careful poisoning. Every day, Wilson drank his coffee and slowly poisoned himself. The symptoms accumulated. His vision became increasingly unreliable. He had trouble focusing. His hands shook enough that he couldn't write clearly. By late 1847, Wilson's condition was serious enough that his family became involved. His father came from Mobile to check on him, was alarmed by Wilson's deteriorating health, insisted he see better doctors. The doctors were baffled. Wilson's symptoms didn't match any obvious disease. They suggested everything from overwork to stress to early-onset neurological degeneration. Nobody tested his coffee, because why would they? It was coffee prepared by a trusted house slave, the same way every day. By early 1848, Wilson was functionally blind. His vision was so unreliable that he couldn't manage his affairs. His father took over running the plantation. The family discussed what to do with Wilson long-term. In March 1848, Nancy Kelly was sold again. Wilson's father was restructuring the household, selling off assets he deemed unnecessary. Nancy was considered an expense that could be eliminated. She was purchased by her fifth master, George Hamilton. George Hamilton was the youngest of Nancy's masters, only 28 years old. He'd inherited a plantation near Boligy, Alabama, from an uncle, and was trying to prove himself as a capable manager. Hamilton was insecure in his authority and overcompensated by being especially strict. He believed that any sign of kindness or flexibility would be interpreted as weakness, so he maintained rigid control, punished harshly, and constantly watched for any sign of resistance. Nancy arrived at Hamilton's plantation and recognized immediately that he was dangerous in a different way than her previous masters. Hamilton was paranoid, suspicious, constantly watching for threats. She would need to be more careful than ever. Nancy spent weeks just observing, not making any moves. Hamilton's paranoia made him unpredictable. He'd suddenly check things that had never interested him before. He'd ask unexpected questions. He'd test people to see if they were being honest. But even paranoid people have blind spots. And Nancy had years of experience finding them. Hamilton's vulnerability was his vanity about his appearance. He was young, concerned about his status in the community, wanted to present himself as successful and sophisticated. He used cologne, an expensive scent he ordered from Charleston, distinctive and strong. Nancy was responsible for maintaining Hamilton's personal items. She had access to his cologne bottle, and she had developed over 5 years and 4 masters an extensive knowledge of how to poison people subtly. She began adulterating Hamilton's cologne with an extract made from poison hemlock. Carefully processed to isolate the compounds that would be absorbed through the skin and cause progressive neurological damage, including vision problems. The method was slow, but virtually undetectable. Hamilton applied the cologne every morning, dabbing it on his neck and wrists. The poison absorbed through his skin in amounts too small to cause immediate symptoms, but large enough to accumulate over time. For months, nothing seemed to happen. Nancy maintained her careful dosing, adding the poison regularly, but not so much that it changed the cologne's appearance or smell. Then, in late 1848, Hamilton started experiencing symptoms: headaches, dizziness, vision problems that came and went. He blamed it on stress, on the difficulty of managing the plantation, on the Alabama heat. Nancy continued her work, patient, careful, invisible. By mid-1849, Hamilton's vision was noticeably compromised. He had trouble reading documents. He couldn't see things clearly at a distance. His eyes were constantly irritated and watering. He consulted doctors who found no obvious cause. They prescribed rest, different spectacles, various treatments. Nothing helped because the problem wasn't natural. It was poison, applied daily, accumulating in Hamilton's system. Hamilton became increasingly frustrated and paranoid. His failing vision made him feel vulnerable, less in control. He started suspecting conspiracies, thinking people were plotting against him. Ironically, he never suspected Nancy. She was too perfect a servant, quiet, obedient, invisible. The idea that she could be slowly blinding him never crossed his mind. By late 1849, Hamilton's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could barely function. His vision was severely compromised. He had tremors in his hands. He was increasingly unstable mentally, the paranoia worsening as the poison affected his nervous system. His family intervened, took over management of the plantation, moved Hamilton to town, where he could be supervised. In January 1850, Nancy Kelly was sold one more time to a slave trader who was assembling a group of enslaved people to sell in the deeper South. This should have been the end of Nancy's story. She'd blinded 5 masters over 7 years. Nobody had connected the incidents because the masters lived in different places, had different symptoms, seemed to have different illnesses. The pattern was invisible because Nancy had made it invisible. But patterns, eventually, become visible to someone paying attention. A doctor named Samuel Price had treated 3 of Nancy's masters, Barrett, Crawford, and Hamilton. In early 1850, he was reviewing his medical notes and noticed something strange. All 3 men had developed progressive vision problems that didn't match any standard disease. All 3 had been otherwise healthy before the symptoms started, and all 3 had owned the same house slave. Price started investigating. He contacted the doctors who'd treated Morrison and Wilson, got their medical records, found similar patterns. 5 men, 5 cases of mysterious vision loss, one common factor: Nancy Kelly. Price brought his findings to the local sheriff in Greene County. The sheriff was skeptical. The idea that an enslaved woman could poison 5 different masters over 7 years without anyone noticing seemed far-fetched. But Price was persistent. He arranged to examine items from the masters' households: bottles, containers, personal effects. He found traces of toxic compounds in Morrison's whiskey decanter, Barrett's eye drops, Crawford's hair tonic, Wilson's coffee pot, Hamilton's cologne bottle. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. Someone had been poisoning these men, using different methods for each one, causing progressive vision damage over months or years. And Nancy Kelly was the only person who'd had access to all 5 households. The sheriff issued a warrant for Nancy's arrest in February 1850. Finding her took months. She'd been sold to a trader who'd moved her twice already. But eventually, she was located in Mississippi and brought back to Alabama to face charges. The trial began in November 1850. It was a sensation. Newspapers across the South covered it. The idea that an enslaved woman had systematically blinded 5 masters was both terrifying and fascinating to white society. The prosecution's case was strong on pattern, but weak on direct evidence. They could show that Nancy had been present in all 5 households. They could show that all 5 men had developed similar symptoms. They could show traces of poison in items Nancy had access to. What they couldn't show was direct proof that Nancy had administered the poison. Nobody had seen her do it. The methods were so subtle that even looking back, it was hard to identify exactly when and how the poisoning had occurred. Nancy's court-appointed lawyer, a young man who'd taken the case reluctantly, argued that the entire case was speculation. Enslaved people moved between households frequently. Finding one person who'd been present in 5 households wasn't particularly remarkable. The vision problems could be coincidental. The trace poisons could have been introduced by anyone. But Nancy herself destroyed her defense. When called to testify, she was asked directly, "Did you poison your masters?" She could have denied it. Without a confession, the evidence was probably insufficient for conviction. But Nancy Kelly had spent 7 years working in secret, never acknowledging what she was doing, always pretending to be the obedient servant. She was done pretending. "Yes," she said calmly, "I blinded them, all of them. And I'd do it again." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. Nancy's lawyer looked stricken. She'd just convicted herself. The prosecutor asked her to explain. Nancy spoke for almost an hour, detailing every incident that had led to her decision to blind each master. Morrison's whipping of Joseph, Barrett's refusal to exonerate Lucy, Crawford's torture of Peter for making eye contact, Wilson's separation of Clara's children, Hamilton's paranoid cruelty toward everyone under his control. "They used their eyes to watch us," Nancy said, "to see when we made mistakes, to witness our pain without caring, to maintain their power over us. So I took their eyes. I made them understand what it's like to stumble in darkness, to be vulnerable, to lose the thing they used to control us." The prosecutor asked why she'd been so subtle, why she'd taken months or years to blind each man instead of acting quickly. "Because I wanted them to suffer the way we suffer," Nancy replied. "Slavery isn't one moment of pain. It's constant, ongoing, never-ending suffering. Every day you wake up enslaved is another day of slow death. So I gave them slow death in return. I wanted them to feel their power slipping away gradually, to become dependent on the people they'd treated as property, to understand helplessness." The prosecutor asked if she had any remorse. "No," Nancy said simply. "They deserved it. Every one of them. They owned human beings. They destroyed families. They beat people for entertainment. They used their power to cause suffering. And when I took their eyes, I didn't kill them. I just made them as helpless as they'd made us. If anything, I was merciful." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty of attempted murder, 5 counts. The judge sentenced her to death by hanging. Nancy showed no emotion when the sentence was read. She'd known from the moment she poisoned Morrison that if caught, she would die. She'd made that calculation years ago and decided the revenge was worth the price. The execution was scheduled for March 15th, 1851. In the weeks leading up to it, Nancy became a controversial figure. Some newspapers portrayed her as a monster a savage who'd committed heinous acts. Others portrayed her as evidence of the dangers of slavery. What happens when you treat people so badly that they become willing to die for revenge? Abolitionists in the North used Nancy's case as propaganda, arguing that slavery created the conditions for such acts of resistance. Southern defenders of slavery insisted Nancy was an aberration, a uniquely evil individual whose actions said nothing about the system itself. The enslaved community across Alabama and beyond had their own opinion. Nancy Kelly was a hero. She'd struck back at masters who represented everything terrible about slavery. She'd done it cleverly, patiently, effectively. And even though she would die for it, her actions proved that enslaved people weren't helpless, that they could fight back in ways masters never anticipated. Songs started emerging in the quarters. Nancy Kelly took their sight, made the masters lose their light. Slow and steady, patient and wise, she became the darkness in their eyes. The morning of the execution, thousands of people came to watch. The crowd was divided. White people who wanted to see justice done. Black people who wanted to witness a martyr. Nancy was brought out at 9 o'clock. She was 31 years old, thin from months in jail, but she walked steadily to the gallows without assistance. The executioner asked if she had final words. Nancy looked out at the crowd, at the white faces eager for her death, at the black faces mourning and proud. "I took the eyes of 5 masters," she said clearly. "Not because I'm evil, but because they were. I made them blind so they'd understand what we live with every day. Helplessness, dependence, vulnerability. I made them stumble in darkness so they'd know what it feels like to lose the thing you need to survive." She paused, then continued. "They're going to hang me for fighting back, for refusing to accept that my only purpose was to serve people who treated me like property. But I want every enslaved person watching this to know, you can fight back. Maybe not the way I did, but in whatever way you can. Resist, sabotage, survive. Make them pay whatever price you can exact. They have power over our bodies. They can beat us, sell us, kill us. But they don't have power over our spirits unless we give it to them. I never gave them my spirit. I took their eyes instead. I'm not sorry. I'm not ashamed. I'm proud. Proud that I made 5 masters understand what it means to be powerless. Proud that I fought back when fighting back meant death. Proud that my last act is telling you, resistance is possible." The executioner placed the noose around her neck. Nancy stood straight, her head high, looking directly at the crowd, even though they were about to end her ability to see anything ever again. They pulled the lever. Nancy dropped. Her neck broke cleanly, a small mercy. The crowd reacted in complicated ways. Some applauded, some wept, some stood in silence, unsure what they'd just witnessed. In the days after the execution, stories about Nancy Kelly spread across the South. Some were accurate, many were exaggerated. All of them contributed to a legend. The enslaved woman who'd blinded 5 masters and shown no remorse. Plantation owners became paranoid about their house slaves. Items that had been trusted, food, drink, personal effects, were suddenly suspect. Some owners started having their meals tested. Others reduced how much they relied on enslaved people for personal service. Medical professionals began studying Nancy's methods, trying to understand how she'd poisoned 5 men over 7 years without anyone noticing. Her techniques became case studies in forensic medicine, examples of how patient, subtle poisoning could evade detection. But in the enslaved communities, Nancy Kelly became something else. Proof that the powerless could hurt the powerful. Evidence that resistance was possible even in the most controlled circumstances. A reminder that patience and planning could accomplish what open rebellion could not. The stories about Nancy evolved over time. Some said she'd blinded more than 5 masters, that there were other victims whose cases were never connected to her. Others claimed she'd taught her techniques to other enslaved women before her execution, that there was a network of poisoners working across the South. Whether those stories were true is impossible to verify. What's true is that after Nancy Kelly's execution, mysterious illnesses among slave owners increased. Vision problems, neurological symptoms, progressive ailments that didn't match standard diseases, all occurred with suspicious frequency in the years following 1851. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was paranoia making people see patterns that didn't exist. Or maybe Nancy Kelly had started something that continued after her death. Historians have debated Nancy Kelly's legacy. Some argue she was a serial attempted murderer who deserves no sympathy regardless of the circumstances. Others argue she was a resistance fighter, using the only weapons available to her. What's not debatable is the sophistication of what she did. Over 8 years, Nancy blinded 5 men using 5 different methods, all subtle enough to avoid immediate detection. She demonstrated remarkable knowledge of toxins, careful planning, and extraordinary patience. She showed that enslaved people weren't passive victims. They were thinking, planning, capable of sophisticated resistance. They fought back in ways that the system never anticipated because the system assumed they were incapable of such complexity. Nancy Kelly's story is uncomfortable because it doesn't fit neat moral categories. She committed acts that, by any standard, constitute serious crimes. She caused permanent harm to 5 people. She showed no remorse for inflicting suffering. But she did it to people who owned human beings, who maintained their power through violence and fear, who treated people as property and enforced that treatment with brutality. So was she a criminal or a freedom fighter, a monster or a hero, someone to condemn or someone to understand? The answer probably depends on whether you believe enslaved people had the right to resist their oppression by any means available, even means that caused permanent harm to their oppressors. Nancy Kelly believed they did. She acted on that belief with remarkable effectiveness, and when caught, she stood on the gallows and told the world she wasn't sorry. Today, there's no marker for Nancy Kelly. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Greene County, Alabama. No monument commemorates her resistance. No official history acknowledges what she did. But in the oral histories of black families in Alabama, Nancy Kelly is remembered. Stories passed down through generations keep her alive. The woman who took the eyes of 5 masters, who showed that the powerless could fight back, who died unrepentant. Her story matters because it shows a side of slavery that makes people uncomfortable. The quiet wars, the subtle resistance, the ways enslaved people fought back when open rebellion meant certain death. Nancy Kelly didn't lead a revolt, didn't escape to freedom, didn't become a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Her resistance was smaller, more personal, more cruel, but it was resistance nonetheless, and it was effective. 5 masters learned that owning Nancy Kelly came with a price: their sight. 5 men who'd used their eyes to maintain control over enslaved people lost the ability to see. 5 symbols of slave owner power were reduced to helplessness by a woman they'd considered property. That's the story of Nancy Kelly. Not simple, not comfortable, not easily categorized as right or wrong, but true and worth remembering. Because forgetting would mean accepting the fiction that enslaved people were passive victims. Forgetting would mean denying the agency, intelligence, and resistance that existed even in the most oppressive circumstances. Nancy Kelly fought back. She did it cleverly, patiently, effectively. She made masters who'd believed themselves untouchable, understand vulnerability. And when they caught her, she stood proud and unrepentant. That's resistance. That's refusal. That's the complicated, uncomfortable truth of how some people survived and fought back in a system designed to crush them. Remember her name. Remember what she did. Remember that she wasn't sorry. And remember that in 1851, they hanged a woman for the crime of making her masters as helpless as they'd made her. And she went to her death telling other enslaved people to keep fighting. That's the legacy of Nancy Kelly. Proof that resistance was possible, that the powerless could hurt the powerful, and that some people would rather die fighting than live submitting. The slave who blinded all her masters. Not because she was evil, but because they were. Remember that, all of it. What do you think about Nancy Kelly's actions? Was she a justified resistance fighter using the only weapons available to her? Or was she a serial criminal whose actions can't be excused regardless of circumstances? Were her 5 masters innocent victims of a murderous slave? Or were they perpetrators who received proportional consequences for their systematic cruelty? Can we celebrate resistance while acknowledging that the methods involved caused permanent, irreversible harm? These are questions without simple answers. Nancy Kelly spent 8 years patiently blinding 5 different men, using sophisticated knowledge of toxins and remarkable planning abilities. Her actions caused real suffering to real people. But those people owned human beings, maintained their power through violence, and created the conditions that made Nancy's resistance seem like the only available option. Was what she did justice? Revenge? Terrorism? Resistance? Maybe it's all of those things simultaneously. Maybe moral clarity is impossible when evaluating actions taken within an immoral system. Maybe the most honest thing we can do is acknowledge the full, complicated truth. Nancy Kelly did terrible things to terrible people, and both those facts matter. Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates historical narratives that resist simple moral categorization. The stories that challenge us to think about resistance, violence, and justice in complex circumstances are often the most important to preserve. At History in Chains, we believe in presenting history honestly, acknowledging that the past contains situations that modern moral frameworks struggle to adequately address, and preserving narratives that reveal the human costs of slavery in ways that transcend simple categories of villain and victim. We explore how enslaved people fought back, using whatever means available to them, even when those means were cruel, calculating, and designed to cause permanent harm to their oppressors. Nancy Kelly's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about resistance, about the limits of moral judgment when evaluating actions taken under extreme oppression, and about how we remember people who fought back in ways that don't fit our comfortable narratives of noble suffering. See you in the next video.